Hi, welcome to Exam AZ-900 Microsoft Azure Fundamental Study Guide. This is episode 12 of 63, Azure Storage Products. Tim Warner here, happy to be your instructor. Today's objective comes from the functional group in the AZ-900 Microsoft Azure Fundamentals exam, Understand Core Azure Services. Passing into the objective describes some of the core products available in Azure. We've been taking this tour subsystem by subsystem, compute and then networking, and today is about storage. Describe products available for storage such as blob storage, disk storage, file storage, and archive storage. Let's do this. The general purpose storage account in Azure has 4 services in it to store 4 types of data. The Blob service stores unstructured or binary data. Now, what's Blob? Blob stands for binary large object, and unstructured means that it's just a regular file. It could be a log file, a document file, a media file, or it could be a binary file, an image or an executable file. Unstructured means that the data is not being validated, like, say, in a relational database table, you have all of those constraints that control the kind of data that can be placed into the table. An ordinary file that you create in, say, Microsoft Word is totally unstructured. That's the Blob service. The file service uses blobs, but it handles them differently. Blob service is just very similar to Amazon Web Services S3 or OneDrive or Dropbox. It's that kind of thing. But the file service is about your being able to publish highly available file shares. You know, in an on-premises network, you might be accustomed to going to your Q drive or your S drive to find your project files. Those are what are called mapped drives, and they go to a file share. And as it happens, you can host cloud-based file shares in Azure. And those can be really useful, and I'll show you an illustration of that utility in the upcoming demo. The second 2 services are predominantly of importance to application developers. The table service stores structured, non-relational data. So I sometimes call it semi-structured, key-value pair data. And the table service is now a part of the Azure Cosmos DB. That's their mainline non-relational database system. Lastly, there's Queue service, and this deals with asynchronous message storing and retrieval. So your application developer may have the application divided into different components. Those components need to send and receive data between them. The Queue service provides a really convenient way to do that. Now, we're going to drill in a bit further on blob storage because it's so prevalent and so useful. The general purpose V2 storage account in Azure allows you to tier your blob storage, and that's going to give you a cost savings depending upon how you access the blob data. There are 3 tiers that you can choose from. One is hot for frequently accessed data. The idea there is that you get a discount on your transaction fees. We don't need to get down into the weeds on how Azure products are priced, but storage has quite a few elements that go into its pricing. One is how often you access the data. Another is how much space you're actually occupying in the storage account. And hot, you get a discount on your transactions because you're frequently accessing the data, but you don't get a discount on the footprint, the amount of space you're occupying. Cool is just the opposite. For infrequently accessed data, Microsoft says, say, once every 30 days, although that's not a restriction, that's just guidance. Here you get a break on your disk footprint because the idea is maybe it's more or less archival data, at least infrequently accessed, but you don't get a discount on your transactions. And lastly, for data that you need cold storage for, rarely accessed data, you've got archive. And archive will actually put your blob storage on ice, or in an inaccessible state. You have to actually rehydrate the data to bring it out of archive, and that does cost. You get a great discount across the board for archive, but then you pay for rehydration. And when you bring a blob out of archive, you place it into either the hot or cool tiers. Lastly, there's virtual machine disk storage. If you're running Windows Server, Windows Client, or Linux virtual machines in Azure, the operating system disk and data disks are files. That's the idea of the virtual machine. These files have the VHD extension, although nowadays they can be either Generation 1 or Generation 2. Again, if that's too technical for you, let it go. I know that the Azure fundamental skill set is not only for IT professionals. But at any rate, what I'm saying is that disk storage does not require storage accounts. Instead, you should be storing your VM disks in what Azure calls managed disks. This is great. It used to be years ago that you did, in fact, have to store your VM disks in blob storage in a storage account. And there were lots of security security possibility problems there and performance possibility problems there that are now removed because we can let Azure take care of almost everything about storing the disk. We can just use the disks with our VMs, and we can also do some neat management things on those virtual disks. Things like taking snapshot backups of those disks, resizing those disks. If you feel that your C drive on your Windows Server VM is getting too small, just shut down the VM, resize the disk, start the machine up, and you're good to go. It's amazing the stuff that you can do in the cloud, and also applying full disk encryption to keep your security people happy and make sure that you're passing your compliance audits. In this demonstration, we're going to tour some of the touch points for the storage-related objective on the AZ-900 exam. We're in the Azure portal, and I'm going to start by bringing you to the Managed Disk service. As you can see here, we've got disks, and this is where your virtual machine disks are stored by default. And we can see I've got a VM named Server 1, and I've got a VM0 server and a VM1. And you can see that the names include OS and data. It's a good idea to add those identifiers because the OS disk is the one that runs the operating system. And then you can attach n number of data disks to the virtual machine as well. Those disks can be either lower speed HDD storage, that's mechanical, magnetic hard drive storage, or higher speed, no moving parts, solid state disk or SSD storage. And there's cost ramifications, but there's also performance and high availability ramifications as well. Now, I think all three of these servers are on, so I'm not sure how much we can do with the managed disk, but let me just show you a couple of the points. On the overview page, you can take a snapshot backup of the disk with just a couple clicks of the mouse here, as you can see. I'm going to step back because I don't actually want to take that snapshot. If we head on over to the configuration blade, again, this is all grayed out because the disk is in use. We would have to stop and deallocate the virtual machine to get to these controls. But this is where you can change from HDD to SSD or back. You can resize the disk, etc. There's some things that you can only do in Azure programmatically, say with Azure PowerShell or the Azure CLI. Applying disk encryption would be an example of that. Now let's turn our attention to the general purpose storage account. If I can type, there we go. And I'm just going to come into this general purpose V2 storage account I have called TW Cloud Storage, and we can see here those 4 services. Now, this containers used to be called the Blob service. I don't know why Microsoft changed the name to containers, especially if you scroll down in the settings, you can see that it's called the Blob service. This inconsistency you see sometimes in Azure, I think is just a function that this is such a huge product with so many different developer teams. We have to forgive Microsoft that. Then we've got file shares, tables, and queues, as I mentioned before. Now let me go into the container service, and it looks like we have a few containers here. If I go into scripts, for instance, by the way, a container functions basically like a folder or a directory, and then these are the individual blobs. Now notice that you can upload, you can download, we can select a blob from the list and come over to the right-hand side and open this little ellipsis, and we can download, we can take snapshot backups of our blobs, and check this out, we can change the tier. If you're wondering about access tiering, you do this at the blob level, and as I mentioned, you've got 3 options, hot, cool, and archive. And remember, I told you that if you choose archive, that's got some ramifications to it. It's going to make the blob inaccessible unless and until you rehydrate it. For example, let me save this change, and we now can see that my managed storage account PowerShell script is an archive access tier. That now means also if I select that blob, I'll see certain controls like download grayed out because it is in fact inaccessible unless and until we change the tier again and bring the blob out of archive and into hot. Now, Microsoft tells you, as you can see right below here, rehydrating a blob from archive could take several hours to complete. This should be pretty fast because it's a tiny little file and it's only been in archive for less than 1 minute, but that's just something to consider. All right, now with the file service, I want to show you that in the context of Azure Cloud Shell. See this button up here that looks like a command prompt? The first time you start Cloud Shell in the Azure portal, you'll be required to choose a storage account. Why is that? Because in the Cloud Shell environment, which is essentially, it's just a cloud-based PowerShell session. As you can see, you can also do a cloud-based bash shell session. But Azure PowerShell, this is really convenient because you get PowerShell and you're already signed in and you don't have to install anything on your computer. You can use Azure PowerShell directly from a browser. Well, guess what? you can actually save all of your scripts and work files in your Azure Cloud Shell Cloud Drive. Let me show you. Let me clear the screen here, CLS, and type get Cloud Drive. That's a special purpose PowerShell commandlet that I use only within Cloud Shell. And it's saying here that in my storage account, TW Cloud Storage, I have a file share called TW Cloud Share. And in there, mounted to my local environment under Home Tim Cloud Drive, I can put all my stuff. So that means I can do a cd:/cloud drive. And now if I do an ls or a directory listing, I can see these files that in the past I've put. Looks like there's some PowerShell files and some folders. How did I get those? Well, let me show you how easy it is. This menu right here, upload, download, if you open it and then go to manage file share, you'll see in the top part of the window, it brought us directly into that storage account and directly into that file share. And there's those files that you see down below. Isn't that great? So this is a good example of how Microsoft uses the file share service in Azure General Purpose Storage accounts in a novel way, that wherever I am in the world, if I need to do some work in Azure and I want to do so using programmatic means like PowerShell, all I have to do is point my browser into the portal, sign in, and fire up my Cloud Shell, and I'll have everything I need. Thanks, as always, for joining me. You can find me on Twitter at TechTrainerTim. My Pluralsight courses are at timw.info/ps, and my website is techtrainertim.com. I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.